Spoke to Alan the other day, John. Sounds like he's doing great things at the FDA.
Yeah, he's in charge of that TAP program. So I introduced him to Doug Kelly.
Hey, I should have thought of this sooner, but I'll connect with you after this to invite you to this thing we're doing in DC, April 2nd and 3rd. It's the AHA MedTech Innovator Heart and Brain Accelerator,
Okay.
and uh, it would be worth your time to go just because of the people going, and I'll connect with you after. And if you have the time to come, it'd be great to have you.
All right, buddy. Sounds good. Thanks.
Well, it looks like we have a wonderful group of people joining us. I am so excited to have my good friend, uh, Ken Nelson from MedTech Advantage Fund join us today. For those of you who are in the device industry, he is a well-known name and he's been in the digital health arena for a very long time. Um, for the past 20 years, he's led multiple organizations, including some in medical device, remote patient monitoring, with successful senior leadership experience ranging from Fortune 500 companies like Boston Scientific to market share leading medium-sized company biotelemetry, and three startups, one of which eventually led to a very successful IPO that we're familiar with in iRhythm, and another that was just acquired by the name of Bardi for in excess of 400 million plus after milestone payments. He has continues to be energetically involved in this field, being involved with multiple startups, being on boards of many other ones, and his most recent endeavor is serving as a partner in the MedTech Advantage Fund, which works very closely with partnership with MedTech Innovator, which is the largest MedTech and digital health startup accelerator globally. And he serves as the chairman to the board of Cardiac Care and is an active member of lots of very disruptive digital health and medtech companies. So uh, I'm so excited to hear his perspective on investment trends in cardiovascular technologies. And without further ado, welcome to Michigan. He's no stranger to us, but welcome back, I should say, Ken.
Thanks, Dr. Gambari. Appreciate it and appreciate the intro and appreciate the opportunity. Very passionate about innovation in the space, as you know, and was lucky to have started in the space with a company called Guidant, which later got acquired by Boston Scientific in the cardiac rhythm management division. And it's kind of fun that this event is happening during the LSI Emerging MedTech Summit. So I'm out here in Dana Point. And I actually spent some time with Manny Villafania last night, who started CPI, which became Guidant, and also started St. Jude Medical, total legend in the space. And what I told him last night was my entire device career has been built on the mentors and the culture that I experienced at Guidant and the unbelievable people that they had at Guidant, which was the company that he started. So it's been a fun couple days. I've had very good mentors, as I mentioned, and then I've gotten really great opportunities and fortunate to have John Hunt on the call, who's also a former Guidant guy. He gave me my opportunity at Bardi, which was the last startup that I commercialized. So just I've been lucky to work with really great people and been involved with some great innovations and happy to talk about some of the things happening in the space from an investment standpoint. And in fact, today I'm moderating a panel with Chris Esso, who just took over for Chris Cleary, running ventures and M&A for Medtronic. as well as Nate Harrington who runs Phillips Ventures, Lisa Sunin, uh, who just started AHA Ventures, who also started back in the day Cardiation Capital, which is Aphelion, UPMC, Phillips Ventures, and now RCT Ventures, but also AHA is a part of that investment vehicle, and they were actually an investor in Barty. And so we're talking about a lot of the same things we'll be talking about in this panel, but also how do you get the big device companies to collaborate with the startup ecosystem to further accelerate innovation in the cardiac space. So appreciate the opportunity and happy to answer questions as we go through this presentation or afterwards. So this just want to talk about MedTech Innovator for a second and the fund. I can't say a whole lot about the fund, but I do want to talk about MedTech Innovator for a minute because it's extremely helpful for anybody on the call who's a startup, not necessarily have to be cardiac startup, but any startup in medical devices or digital health or diagnostics. The biggest startup accelerator in the world is MedTech Innovator. It was started by Paul Grand 12 years ago. Paul's a former RCT Ventures guy, and I'll talk about the accelerator here in a second. But on top of that accelerator, we've started MedTech Advantage Fund, which will be investing only in alumni companies of MedTech Innovator. And so we started that with Paul Grand, myself, Chris Neal, who is former Maxim Ventures, and then Patrick O'Neill from Connecticut Innovation. So I know we sound a little bit like a law firm with O'Neill, Neal, and Nelson, but we're trying to start a venture fund, and it will be, like I said, exclusively investing in alumni companies of MedTech Innovator. So MedTech Innovator, it's now actually in its 12th year. I know it says 11th year, but over 600 alumni companies. We've had 46 exits. Unbelievably, 95% of the 600 plus alumni companies are still in business or have gotten acquired. And that number, for anybody who knows the startup world, many startups fail within the first couple years, and then I think the success rate after 10 years is really, really low. And we've got 95% still in business or acquired, which is outstanding. We've had almost 300 FDA approvals and just unbelievable people involved in the entire ecosystem. And as you can see below, per Cipher Bio, which is really PitchBook data, it's the biggest healthcare startup accelerator in the world, even bigger than Y Combinator and some of the other big names you may have heard in the past. And looking at the ecosystem, and if you're looking to get better access to capital, if you're looking to get better interactions with not only venture capital people, but also strategics like J&J and Edwards, Siemens, et cetera. I just wanted to show who's in the network, who are sponsors of the events. J&J is and RCT Ventures are the two biggest sponsors. It's a non-profit accelerator. They don't take any money from the companies, which most of these accelerators do. And they give away over $1 million in non-dilutive capital. And so when you think about how do you increase the chances for success of a startup, whether it's cardiac or otherwise, going through accelerators can be extremely helpful. There are local accelerators, there are regional accelerators, there are national accelerators, and there are global accelerators. This is a global one. And you can see from the names here of the companies that are sponsors. We get people from the FDA coming to the events, from CMS, from commercial payers. You can look at some of on the top right there, some of the VCs that come to the events. It's huge names. It's NEA, it's Sofinova, it's Aphelion, it's RCT. really big names on the venture side. And then from a hospital side, the hospital venture groups that come, it's Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, Cedars. We'll have people from University of Michigan at the event coming up here in a few weeks. The next event is going to have a cardiac focused accelerator, a heart and brain accelerator, in collaboration with the American Heart Association. So highly recommend for those startups on the call next year to apply to get into MedTech Innovator, but also to try to get into the Heart and Brain Accelerator, which is in collaboration with the American Heart Association. As you can see from the list here of exits, a number of different cardiac companies involved here, CathWorks being one, Barty being another. So just a really great network of companies and really great success rate if you can get into the program. This year we've had 2,200 companies apply to get in. We'll pick a couple hundred to pitch, and then we'll pick about 100 to go through the program. So it's very competitive, but if you can get into the program, having gone through it myself as CCO of Barty, I found it extremely, extremely impactful in a number of different ways, including things that you may not think about from an accelerator that they can help you with. And one of those things that I didn't realize early on with the first startup I was commercializing, but some of the things that are so important are things like the protocol design for clinical studies. Not only do you want to design it to make sure you can get FDA clearance or CE mark or whatever the country's body is you're trying to get clearance in, but you also need to think about designing the study to get payer coverage. So you can design a study that may get you clearance, but may not get you payer coverage, which could cost you millions of dollars. And so I think making the FDA your friend and asking them questions early is really important. And these are some of the things that you learn as you go through some of these accelerator programs. Just to give you an example of my experience with this program and some of the impact that it had, going through and pitching, they get you to focus on a 1-minute pitch, which is really important for really getting down to they talk about an elevator pitch, but this kind of forces you to in one slide talk about a company in a minute or less, and so you really crisp up your messaging. And that was really helpful as you go into fundraising and trying to pitch the company to get funding. A lot of times that first meeting, you're really trying to get a longer second meeting, and you learn that eventually as you start to try to raise money, that first meeting is not about trying to get the money, it's trying to get them interested to have a longer discussion with a bigger group of people. And MedTech Innovator really helped out with that. It led to other pitch events, some pediatric pitch events. So we had a pediatric indication and really went after the pediatric market, which became like 25% of our overall business. So trying to find those niches where you can really get some adoption early is really helpful, and they kind of help you figure out where you can focus your time, and then where to go, which types of investors to go after, based on the stage of your company, the amount of money that you're raising, etc. It was just a really helpful group. And then we, to raise awareness and then eventually drive adoption of the technology, we would do lots of different pitch events to do that. And so I highly recommend you try to go through a couple accelerators and go to these pitch events and try to get your name out there, and obviously try to win those events so that you can press release that and just get the name of the company out there. One of the people, and highly recommend from a resource standpoint, if you want to know what's happening in MedTech and digital health investing, John Norris, who's former Silicon Valley Bank and now at HSBC, he for years now has put out a quarterly report on investing trends from a venture standpoint, as well as M&A trends, and that has been, for me and for many others, kind of the Bible of trending in investing from a venture standpoint and M&A activity. And he gives it away to people, so it's not something you have to pay for, but it's an unbelievable resource that all of us in the industry are grateful that he has put together for years now, and he's continuing to do it at HSBC. And so this is a slide from his latest deck, and it talks about some of the financing trending by indication, and as you can see here, it looks like in 2023 there were $27 million worth of deals from a financing standpoint in the cardiovascular space. But as I'm reading this slide, there had to have been a lot more deals than that. So I'm trying to think of the specifics on this one. But that's a great resource to dig into. A lot of good details in there, and can go through the trending. What I can tell you from where the dollars are going, you're starting to see a lot more in the wearable space. You're starting to see technologies that have a single parameter. So let's talk about cardiac patch monitoring for a second. Those technologies are evolving from just being ECG cardiac arrhythmia monitors to multi-parameter vital signs monitors. So you're starting to see that evolution take place. And then on top of that, some companies are also developing AI arrhythmia detection to further enable those innovations on top of the patch technologies that they're developing. Some are standalone AI companies that they can license the technology out to existing players, but there's some, and one of the companies that I'm talking about is Smart Cardia out of Lausanne, Switzerland, where they have essentially developed a cardiologs type technology, but think about a next generation cardiologs technology, and then the next generation Vital Connect type of multi-parameter vital signs monitor with 7-lead ECG within the same device. And it's all in one. So they have two companies in one. And so you'll start to see more companies like that emerging. Those are the types of companies that the ones that start to lead and get the most adoption in that specific area. Those are the types of companies that are going to get financed. Those are the types of companies that are going to get acquired, and those are the types that are going to drive new revenue going forward. You're starting to see on the implantable side really cool new sensors. So there's some companies that are emerging now with implantable blood pressure sensors using ultrasound technology. You're seeing companies like Akurey out of Sweden that has a non-invasive CardioMEMS type technology, which is really, really cool when you think about not having to implant a device and be able to manage chronic conditions like heart failure non-invasively. There's companies that are starting to treat things like atrial fibrillation non-invasively, and a company that I'm on the board of out of Israel called Cardiacare has a watch that is treating atrial fibrillation with neuromodulation stimulation non-invasively. So really cool, interesting technology on the therapeutics and both the diagnostics and therapeutics front that are treating some of these conditions non-invasively or managing them non-invasively, which is really cool to see. In terms of some of the innovation themes in healthcare, cardiology included, you're starting to see a lot more personalized medicine, and artificial intelligence is helping with that. I think um, there was a period of time where there was a lot of technology, and there still is, that's not necessarily AI, but people say it's AI, so it's given AI somewhat of a bad name. But for those who are really following the space closely, there's a lot of real AI and a lot of AI that's working, and especially on the cardiology front and on arrhythmia detection, on the imaging front. So companies like Clearly, Lucid, Caristo that are using AI to enable their technology. Um, there's some really great real artificial intelligence that's working and driving innovation in space. So I think you'll start to see uh, a lot of funding in the AI space continue to get accelerated. And then on the drug discovery side of things, enabling AI in drug discovery is also happening. And then you're seeing some of the organizations and the cardiac side of things really digging into digital health. Heart Rhythm Society has started HRX, which is the Digital Health Summit of Heart Rhythm Society, and they're really fostering innovation in digital health. So that's great to see. And you're seeing a lot of M&A and IPO activity starting up again. So you saw a really big lull in IPO and M&A activity, but now in the last quarter or so, you've seen a lot more activity in that space. And then I want to talk about the ecosystem here for a second, but I'm going to pause just to see if Hamid or anybody has any questions on the stuff I've talked about so far, but then I'll jump into the ecosystem.
I have one specific question, Ken.
Sure.
So, specifically regarding the cardiac diagnostics and the multi-modality monitoring. So generally, we're seeing a lot of our, some of our companies and then a lot of companies that are coming in realizing that the margins for the RPM codes are quite low. And as a result of that, we're seeing a lot of people focus on value-based care models as a way of capturing more revenue going forward. And it's almost always in every pitch that we see that's the future um, plan or model. Um, as a VC, how are you viewing that? How doable is it? And what is your overall sense of the likelihood of capturing the value-based care model as a way of increasing your revenue going forward?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's a difficult question. There's a lot of analysts asking that same question. I'm not a reimbursement expert at all, but I do understand that people are talking about that a lot. Uh, what I can say is that if you can figure out a shared risk model based on outcomes, um, it's difficult to do it. But if you can figure out something that works, I think it's worth pursuing. But there has not been great success to date that I'm aware of on figuring out how do you capitalize on a value-based care system. And I think the way the reimbursement model is today, everybody's so focused on getting a CPT or DRG code that they talk about value-based care, but startups are way more focused on a CPT code or a DRG code that's either existing to get revenue right away or trying to get a new code established, and they're less focused on, how do you figure out new and different and creative ways to capitalize on value-based care. But again, not an expert by any means in that space, so would love to maybe open that up to the audience if there's anybody out there that does have better knowledge and can answer that question better. Because I just it's a really tough one. I don't know the best way to answer that. I mean, but great question.
Yeah, it's a hard one for us too because I don't know how to model that in the future. One thing I could share with you is that during some of the conversations I've been having with payers, especially the private payers, is they're concerned about the high percentage of patients that are disenrolling and re-enrolling. So they really can't uh, realize a lot of um, benefit down the road because so many people that enroll in these VBC programs disenroll and go to a different payer. So they can't, if you are instituting a hypertension prevention program in your anthem, for example, and a person switches a year later, you really are not going to realize that benefit down the road. So they're like very hesitant to kind of do a lot of this risk sharing model. Not as much with Medicare and Medicaid, but definitely with our private payers, that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how things are evolving, and again, if people can come up with creative ways that they can bring to payers that they feel like can work, by all means, bring those ideas forward. And I don't know if we want to open it up to the people who are on the call or not yet, but it's I'd love to hear if people have different perspectives on that from the audience. Um, but uh, getting and let's talk about reimbursement strategy for a second, because if you're thinking about investing trends and trying to raise capital, if you don't have a good reimbursement pathway and haven't spent the time and energy and money and gotten reimbursement consultants like NAMSA or Equitas or some of these consulting groups to help you out, it is well worth the money. Don't make it an afterthought. It can really slow down your fundraising process if you don't have a good story around reimbursement and that reimbursement pathway. So yeah, but great question. I mean, that's a tough one. So talking about the ecosystem for a minute, and I'll focus on Texas just to talk about a local ecosystem, just because I live there. But to give you an idea, and this is similar in a lot of the bigger cities, but you've got incubators for earlier stage companies that are kind of at the formation stage. A lot of academic institutions have incubators, and they can kind of help you with uh, forming a company and idea stage, and really starting to get the initial things going. And then once you have a company started, you have a product, and you're going through the approvals process. Highly recommend you look at some of the bigger accelerators. So you transition from an incubator to an accelerator, and there's lots of local ones. And to talk about Texas for a minute, in Dallas, you've got Health Wildcatters, and in Fort Worth, you've got TechStars and their physical health accelerator. You've got UT Southwestern Blackstone Launchpad. Down in Houston, you have TMC, the Texas Medical Center Innovation Group. And then you have ones that are not necessarily healthcare focused, but have a good chunk of healthcare companies. And one of those would be Capital Factory, which has locations in Dallas, Austin, Houston, San Antonio. And then you've got more cardiac focused accelerators. So one of those, and one that I'm on the board of, is HeartX, which used to be Health Tech Arkansas. And that's in collaboration with MedAxiom, which is an American College of Cardiology company. You've got the inaugural, and this is coming up April 2nd in DC, Heart and Brain Accelerator, which is a collaborative effort between the American Heart Association and MedTech Innovator, which is going to be, a great accelerator going forward. In tandem with that, AHA has an investment vehicle called Cardiation Capital, which is run by Aphelion, and also includes Philips, RCT Ventures, and UPMC, and the newly formed AHA Ventures. And they also have the Social Impact Fund. So 3 different investment vehicles from American Heart Association, and some of the other cardiac um, um, industry associations are really starting to look at making investments and starting venture funds. So you may see the other big industry players and associations starting venture funds kind of in the tailwind of AHA doing that. You've got the cardiac industry focused events, the traditional stuff like AHA and HRS and ACC, TCT, the AF Symposium, Western AFib, Heart Failure Society of America. And then you see some of the newer events like HRX, which is the Digital Health Summit of Heart Rhythm Society, really fostering innovation. They're having pitch events. So if you're looking to get awareness of your company and your startup out there, highly recommend you go to all of those things if it makes sense. Some of them can be um, more money than you may want to spend as a startup, but what I'll say is that you have so many people that you can meet with in the same location. So from a cost effectiveness standpoint, even though the dollars may look high, if you can see that many people in the same location over a couple day period, it's really worth your time, energy, and money to do it. And HRX is a great way to access people, even more so than HRS, because there's less time commitments. People's schedules are a little bit looser, and you get more access to people. And then when you're in the fundraising side of things, so think about those events I just mentioned as more of a customer facing events and trying to raise awareness and drive adoption of your technology. But on the fundraising side of things, there's events like the one I'm at this week, LSI Emerging MedTech Summit, which is just an unbelievable event to network with venture capitalists, with corporate venture people, corporate development people from the bigger device companies, and other startups. So there's a lot out there. So I just wanted to make people aware of the LSI events. MedTech Strategist and MedTech Innovator collaborate on a number of different events. MedTech Innovator has a West Coast pitch event, which happened last week at UCLA. They've got an East Coast event happening in DC April 2nd and 3rd. So highly recommend you go to their website and apply to try to get a chance to pitch to their events. This year we had 2,200 companies apply to get in. We'll pick a couple hundred to pitch, then we'll pick about 100 to go through 3 different accelerator programs. And if you don't get in the first time, just keep applying and try to get in until you can get in. It's well worth it if you do get in. And again, as I mentioned earlier, they don't take any equity, they don't ask for any money, and they only give away non-dilutive funding. So it is an absolute win for any company that can get in. And I say that having gone through it as a startup. AdvaMed also has great events in collaboration with MedTech Innovator. Wilson Sonsini does as well. So there's lots of events out there. Some are cardiac focused, others are more MedTech, digital health in general, but great ways to raise awareness about your companies and to network with potential investors. There are some cardiac focused investment vehicles. I talked about Cardiation Capital. I talked about AHA Ventures and their Social Impact Fund. And then there's some cardiac focused venture funds. And so I named a couple of them here on the slide. Aphelion being one, Broadview Ventures, Catalyst Health Ventures, not necessarily all cardiac, but they've got a lot of cardiac investments. And then Solaritus Ventures, which is a newer fund. And their first, I think, 3 investments are all cardiac focused. There are others as well, but just wanted to name a couple. And then you're starting to see a lot more support from the FDA, Medicare, and commercial payers to drive innovation. Alan Baumel, who I worked with, and John, who's on the call, worked with at Barty and some other companies, is now doing a lot of the day-to-day for the TAP program at the FDA, which is the Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program. If you're a cardiac startup and any cardiac company that I'm on the board of, I highly recommend you try to get into that program. You have to have breakthrough status first, which is also a great program from the FDA. And then if you get breakthrough, you can try to get into the TAP program. And the way I describe the TAP program, and this is from listening to Jeff Sheeran and Alan and Doug Kelly talk about it a couple of different times, it sounds like it's a very collaborative effort to accelerate the FDA clearance process, and almost like a concierge service where you get assigned people within the FDA to help you with the different stages that you go through of the approval process. And from people who I know who are in it, they say it's been really great, really helpful. And another great part about it is you don't have to pay them for the advice that they're giving, and they're the ones that are going to clear the product. So it's highly recommended you try to get into that program. And yeah, so those are some of the things that I would recommend you do and spend time on to try to help your success rates of both getting funding, scaling the company, and improving your chances of either getting acquired or really driving adoption as a standalone company. So hopefully that was helpful, Hamid, and happy to answer any questions people might have.
Hey, Ken, thanks for doing this. So as we look at the upstream side of this equation, like the university hospital system, incubators, programs like
Yeah.
that, who do you see as like the most effective with best practices that we might try to apply at U of M as we try to grow our pipeline of investable MedTech spinoffs?
So in terms of the hospital venture groups?
Yeah, I think hospital and university, so the incubator side with Fogarty and like who's doing that really well, and are there any key best practices we might try to apply at Michigan?
Yeah, I mean, obviously Stanford Biodesign has done an amazing job. Fogarty is a great group, and we do an event every year at JP Morgan with MedTech Innovator, Fogarty, and Stanford Biodesign, just because I feel like those three are industry leaders in what they're each independently doing. At Barty, we had Health Enterprise Partners as an investor and Dave Tambury on the board. We had Ascension Ventures as an investor and Rex Health Ventures as investors. And Rex was really helpful, Anita Watkins, in helping us meet the right people within the hospital system. They don't promise you that you can get into the hospital network because they're kind of independent from each other, but they'll give you warm introductions to the right people. And that led to us getting into the system probably a lot faster than we would have on our own. So they were really helpful. Health Enterprise Partners, their LPs are all hospital systems. So some of those hospital systems have venture groups, others don't, but they were really proactive and helpful in making introductions to the right people. And so when we were scaling and trying to get adoption and raise awareness about what we were doing, they would send us a list of their LPs, and we would go back to them and say, hey, we'd love an introduction to this system, and they would introduce us to the right people. And a lot of times that accelerated the process for us trying to get into the contracting process for those hospitals. So highly recommend HEP. Ascension Ventures was good, and Rex Health was great in helping us. I think some of the well-known cardiac groups like Mayo Clinic Ventures and Cleveland Clinic Ventures, but both those guys are out here this week at LSI, by the way, which if you're a startup raising money, you need to be at this event. But they're all very helpful. Some are really proactive in trying to help you with getting into the process and getting contracted into the system, and then others, and I don't really want to name them. We can talk offline, but some of them are just not as helpful. But we can talk about that maybe offline at some point.
Great, thanks. I appreciate it. And since you had John Norris's slide up there, we got to give a shout out to U of M spinoff AVS Pulse, which had one of those big rounds in 2023. That
Yeah.
it's a TRIPSY device for treating calcified plaques. So to all the U of M people on the call, I mean, there's some cool stuff spinning out. We just want to, like, learning from you is how we increase that pipeline of more of those success stories.
Yeah, John. So John is, I think he's out here at this event as well, and I appreciate you bringing his name up again, because he's been such a helpful person to the industry, and his report that he's got to spend a ton of time generating every quarter is really helpful for all of us. And I'll send it, Hamid. I'll send you that report so that people have it, and can try to get on his list of distribution. But it's a great resource, and we'll share it with whoever's on the call.
John, I don't know if a lot of people on this call know exactly about your organization at Michigan, but can you give like a little brief overview of, our venture fund and how that works within Michigan as well?
Yeah, sure. So I manage the Michigan Biomedical Venture Fund. So we invest in spinoffs in the life science space. So in addition to MedTech, there's diagnostics, therapeutics, health IT. So we're here to try to provide some of those early checks and support, along with the impressive organization around innovation partnerships that has the mentors and residents, the licensing teams, their own investment fund to support those. So I think I ask those questions because I look to the Stanfords of the world as we want to continue to up our game. There's other things we need to do to facilitate a lot of the expertise that's outside the university. I would say, when I see the gaps, it's not about the academic and clinical talent and the great research. It's the handoff to investors that have insight. What are the strategics looking for, the things that you take into consideration, and they're not quite. It doesn't percolate through the halls here quite as much as it does at Stanford or MIT. So I think these types of calls, your list of conferences is great, because that's how you get immersed in that knowledge that helps you think about what is going to be acquirable at a later stage. So
yeah, and I think you're starting to see a lot of people more open to collaborating across the startup ecosystem, and even between MedTech Innovator and not only the device companies, venture capital groups, but you're starting to see the hospital venture groups as sponsors and integrated in. And we're actually, you probably know this, John, but Hamid and I are working on trying to get a collaboration between MedTech Innovator and the hospital system, so that when these really cool emerging startups have great products, they need to get them tested and validated and figure out how to put the right clinical study protocols together. We want to have a couple hospital systems that they can partner with, and have something set up to make it easy to go through that process, because sometimes that contracting process can take months or sometimes longer. I talked to somebody today who said it's taking them a year and they're still not done with the process of trying to get a clinical study started, because the legal back and forth is taking forever. So we've talked about, how do we streamline that process? How do we accelerate it? Because every month that goes by, these startups are burning capital, and some of these startups never make it because things just take too long. And so we're trying to figure out, how do we work together across the startup ecosystem to better enable these startups to be successful and to get some of these things to market faster. And even the FDA, with things like the TAP program that they're trying out, are coming up with creative ways to try to accelerate the process. And it's not going to be for everyone, but hopefully, if some of these things work, you'll see things like the TAP program being expanded, and they've talked about expanding it. I know they've expanded it to neuro as well. And then you'll see a much greater number of companies that they allow to get into the program. But I think having this cross collaboration across the ecosystem is great to see that it's happening at a faster pace now. But yeah, happy to answer any other questions if anybody has questions.
Well, maybe I can kickstart somewhere. Ken, what do you get pitched all the time from companies that are starting out. So can you kind of walk me through your thinking as you're seeing a pitch? Specifically, if you could kind of tell me like why you wouldn't want to invest in someone after their pitch. Like what are the common mistakes that you've
Yeah,
seen?
yeah. So great question. I can tell you through the MedTech Innovator process, the way that the process works in their pitch events is companies all do 1 minute pitch at the beginning. So first of all, they apply, they get sub-selected. I think I said 2,200 people applied, pick a couple hundred to pitch. The ones that pitch, they do a 1 minute pitch at the beginning, and then people will pick 6 companies in the morning and 6 in the afternoon that they want to meet with. So there's tables of maybe 6 to 8 people, and they do a 10-minute pitch, 10-minute Q&A, and then midway through the day we stop, and the startup companies go in one room, and the judges go in another, and there's typically about 100 to 200 judges, and it's a mix of startup, not startup, but former startup people, um, venture capitalists, corporate venture, FDA, payers, all across the ecosystem. And we sit in a room, and we basically do a uh, a good, the bad, and the ugly analysis of the companies and the people. And what I can tell you, the number one reason people don't get picked to get into the program is if the kiss of death is if somebody stands up and says, "Oh, that founder is uncoachable." So the word uncoachable is a kiss of death within the accelerator programs, and I'm guessing within the venture capital community as well. If people don't think that the founder or the leadership is going to listen to advice and take advice, and if the arrogance level is off the charts, they're that is probably the biggest killer, to answer your question. And I think the other thing is if people don't have confidence in whoever that leader is, the CEO or whoever's kind of driving some of the things for the company. It could be the COO, CCO, whoever, but the C-suite, if they don't have confidence that they can tell the right story, and that they have perseverance to go, weather the storm, so to speak, of the ups and downs of a startup. I think those are some of the biggest reasons people don't get picked or get funded. And then some of the other reasons, if a company doesn't have a great reimbursement pathway, or it's an afterthought, or there's no reimbursement codes and they haven't thought about what they're going to do to actually have a revenue model, I think that's another big reason people don't get funded or get picked to go through programs like MedTech Innovator.
How do you value clinician founders?
Oh man.
Like you could
um, I think it's going to be person depend. It's all going to depend on the specific person. So I don't want to generalize here. I think the clinical perspective on the technologies is obviously really valuable from physician founders. I've had good experiences with physician founders, and I've had not so great experiences with physician founders. And part of that is not all of them are great business people, and some of them, they're used to directing people versus collaborating with people, and maybe in the lab, and that doesn't necessarily translate to the business world where you need to be more collaborative than directive. But I think for the most part, um, physicians are very creative people. Their clinical knowledge of whatever discipline that they're in is invaluable. So you have to have clinician perspective in the company, and I think it's about making sure that they're in the right role. Not everyone is meant to be a CEO, and I'm not just talking about physicians, but in general, some people are they have a skill set, and it's about putting people in the right roles, and how do you best get their biggest potential for that individual, not just talking about physicians, but in general. And sometimes people get put in the wrong role. And so I think some physicians are cut out to be CEOs, and others are better off being the chief scientific officer, chief technology officer. And so not specific to physicians, but in general, I'd say trying to figure out putting the right people in the right roles is absolutely critical. And to go back to your question earlier, I know you asked about the biggest reasons people don't get picked or selected, but some of the biggest things you do look for are people and culture, and how do you find the right people? How do you put the right people in the right positions? And then how do you build that winning culture of people who are going to stay with the company, who are going to ride out the ups and downs of that company, and are going to love the why of what you're doing with that company. I think, I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek, and I love his Start With Why book. I think building a story and messaging around the why of the company, and I'll tell you, Barty Diagnostics has a great story, and when you hear why Gus Barty started that company, it was really easy to create messaging and to tell that story, and it resonated with people. When you hear about his unfortunate story of his wife passing away after wearing 10 different monitors, none of which could really see her P wave, and then her tragically dying at 52 or 53 years of age from an arrhythmia. And then he started the company a year to the day after her death. I mean, it doesn't get more inspiring and inspiring and motivating than a story like that. And then for him to create a technology that was better than all the other technologies on the market. And I can say that because I built the teams and culture that commercialized the two biggest companies in the space, and to follow after those companies in a space that people said was crowded, couldn't be disrupted, and to actually go into that space, become the number two player in non-real-time monitoring in a very short period of time, because the technology was that much better, and to get the right people to commercialize it. Uh, it's just fun to think about these different parts of cardiac innovation, where people say, "Oh, it's a crowded space and can't be disrupted," yet these spaces get disrupted all the time. So don't get discouraged if people tell you that, because people told me that before every one of the companies that I commercialized. Don't go into that space; it's too crowded, and you're not going to gain market share. And I was told that all three times. Um, so it's finding the right people, putting the right people in the right roles, and then building the right culture, and that can help you disrupt the market.
Hey Ken, I got another one. So I've seen some of the like early stage entrepreneurs almost paranoid about talking to the strategics early. Like they have patent coverage, maybe they're not even a startup quite yet. But I
Yeah.
think MedTech, as your slide showed, it's like that's kind of a key part of customer discovery because the exit is going to be to, a limited number of companies. And either I sort of hear them say, either I'm not far enough along, I want to have great progress to show, or they say like I'm worried about they'll steal my tech. So like what's your advice about like how and when to engage with the strategics? Is earlier better? How do you balance the risk of disclosing something versus the value that you get in understanding the mindset?
Yeah, so that's a tough one too, because it really depends on what the specific technology is you're talking about, how proprietary is the information that you're going to share. If it's not, uh, then definitely I wouldn't worry about it if it's not proprietary information. If you're well protected with patents and Gust, having built a couple startups before, by the time he started Barty, I mean, he built a patent moat around the technology. We had something like 70 plus patents, and he had people like John, who's actually on this call, helping him through that process. In that particular case, we weren't worried about it uh, that much at all. We just wouldn't talk about anything proprietary because he had such a great patent protected, with 70 plus patents around it. If you don't have patents and you do have proprietary information, and you're paranoid, you're paranoid for a reason, and don't do it. Look at the AliveCore Apple story, and those who followed that story closely, it really looked pretty bad from Apple's standpoint that they infringed on AliveCore's patents. Everybody who's close to that, who saw that partnership happen, and then saw Apple come out with the watch after AliveCore had that partnership with them, it really looked like they took that technology. And so um, there's a reason that people get patents and fight those patents in court. And you look at companies like biotelemetry that took a bunch of competitors to court and won patent infringement cases. So there's a reason people are paranoid, but again, it's going to be uh, dependent on the specific technology. Any other questions?
Well, thank you so much, Ken, for taking the time from your very busy schedule. We can definitely talk about this for hours afterwards, and we should definitely bring you on for a round two.
Sure.
But thank you again for spending the time with us. And if anyone has any extra questions or want to reach out to Ken afterwards, please reach out to me or Ashley, or reach out to Ken directly. So thank you again.
Absolutely. Appreciate the opportunity. And again, for those companies that are trying to get into accelerators, highly recommend you look at the big academic institutions or some of the local device focused accelerators in your market. And then eventually, as you start to scale, try to get into MedTech Innovator. And then as you're raising capital, highly recommend the LSI event. So appreciate the opportunity and look forward to catching up in a couple weeks, Hamid, in DC.
Thank you again.
Thanks,
All
Ken.
right.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.